The honourable member for Churchill.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to begin by noting that I'll be splitting my time with my colleague from Edmonton, Strathcona. I stand here proud to represent the people of Northern Manitoba, recognizing that we have incredible diversity in our part of the country, and with it tremendous opportunity as well. The range of human resource, the wealth of human resource in our region, recognizing that we're also one of the youngest regions in Canada in Northern Manitoba. Many young people looking ahead at what they hope will be a bright future, part of communities that are looking down the line to see how they can make their part of the country a better place to live in, our part of the country a better place to live in. But along with that tremendous opportunity and that wealth of knowledge and incredible diversity, there's also some extreme challenges that people in Northern Manitoba face. And perhaps the most acute of these challenges exist on some of the northern remote First Nations that I have the honour of representing. I'd like to point particularly to the reality faced by people in the Island Lake region, 4 First Nations, St. Teresa Point, Garden Hill, Wasagamak, and Red Sucker Lake. Communities that are quickly growing. Many of the people that live in these communities are young. People that are looking ahead at a reality that's very different from the reality that most Canadians realize. And I would argue that that reality is one that, as more Canadians have come to know of it today, is one that shocks many people, because it is so far off of the kind of not just services, but the kind of daily actions that we expect any Canadian to go through. Simply the fact that more than 40% of the 1,880 First Nations homes in Canada that still do not have water service are located in these 4 Island Lake First Nations. More than 800 homes in the Island Lake First Nations are without water service. Every home, as many people know here in this House, is often overcrowded, leaving multiple generations to live with the social turmoil that is involved with such a reality. But what exacerbates that is the fact that so many of these houses do not have running water. A couple years ago, it was important for me to stand up, along with people in our party in the NDP, to call for urgent action when it came to the H1N1 pandemic that hit the Island Lake First Nations disproportionately. Many people wonder why that was in fact the case, but we know that the correlation between influenza, between viruses, between illnesses of all kinds, and the fact that there is no running water is a very strong one. And instead of a long-term plan, this government turned around and the discussion was focused around hand sanitizers. And even when we asked for proper response when it came to medical professionals, the government took a long time to be there. The story of the Island Lake First Nations is one that is more extreme perhaps than others. But other communities that I represent, such as Shamattawa, Hollow Water, Bloodvein, and also Marcel Colombe, which is working to build its First Nation, also face extreme challenges in providing proper water services to their residents. Simply put, the situation facing so many First Nations in Northern Manitoba and across Canada is unacceptable. First Nations people across Canada face third world living conditions, conditions that so many of us could not even imagine. I think of the people that I visited in communities across my constituency and communities in Island Lake, where I have the chance to drive on the ice roads to go and visit every year, if not more than once a year. I remember in this last election, following an extreme pressure from both the media and the leadership in the First Nations in Island Lake, the response given to them by the Ministry of Indian Affairs was a slot pail for every home. In fact, I took a picture with that slot pail, and many people, they looked at, many people in the community, it was a mix of shame, of disgust, and perhaps awe in understanding, trying to understand what this government meant to say. And what they meant to say about perhaps how little they think of these, the reality people in Island Lake face. While today I am pleased to hear that this government is supporting the motion in front of us and is committing to action, I'm eager to know that this action is not around sending a new round of slot pails or water tubs, but in fact looks at long-term investment in these communities. And I'm also concerned that the reality today was not just one that's been developed over the last 5 years, but previous liberal governments have committed to the reality that the unacceptable reality that so many First Nations face in northern Manitoba. Through the starving of capital funds to First Nations, through the imposition of the 2% cap, through the refusal to understand that First Nations people, both under the Liberal and current Conservative governments, deserve the dignity that we all deserve as Canadians. And so today I'm proud to stand with my colleagues in the NDP to call for a real action plan when it comes to supporting the needs of First Nations, to changing this unacceptable reality that they face. And with them, I'd like to call for a visionary approach to what First Nations in Canada are facing today, recognizing that it's not just about clean water, that it's not just about housing, that it's not just about education, that it's about understanding that First Nations people in Canada are time and time again, when it comes to one category or another that denotes quality of life, fall well below their non-Aboriginal counterparts. It shows a structural inability of government after government to deal with First Nations people at an equal level, to recognize the self-governing capacity of First Nations, to recognize that we must work with them in partnership, and to recognize that in the case of Manitoba and First Nations across the country, that we must respect the treaty right that First Nations have in Canada today. And that in doing so, that we commit to changing that reality together. Because as First Nations face third world conditions, it is something that all of us as Canadians face. And that we must recognize that making such change brings tremendous opportunity to all of our country. Recognizing that as First Nations young people, if they are to have proper housing conditions, proper water conditions, and a proper education system, we'll be able to contribute to Canadian society like anybody else can. That our economy will benefit, that our social fabric will benefit, that we will all benefit. And in doing so, what I'm asking for as the Member of Parliament for Churchill on behalf of so many First Nations, and as a proud New Democrat Member of Parliament, is for us to put an end to the piecemeal approaches, or perhaps to the public relations stunts, and actually sit down and work with First Nations who have worked very hard, whose leadership, whose community members, whose organizations have worked very hard to not just put the issues on the table, but to bring solutions forward. Solutions that are based on partnering with other jurisdictions as well, such as provincial governments, partnering with municipal actors in their areas when it comes to other discussions around economic development. But recognizing that at the end of the day, the federal government of Canada has a fiduciary obligation to First Nations. And that the reality of third world conditions that exist on First Nations in Canada today is a shame for the government of Canada and a shame to all of us. And so today, what I am asking is that we put aside the debates of who's done what. The reality is that we are far off the mark in ensuring that First Nations and Aboriginal people in Canada have the same dignity that we all deserve. That we share with them in building a vision that looks at equality, that looks at fairness, that looks at dignity, and that looks at a new way of thinking of the kind of Canada that we want. A Canada where we enjoy the equality, but recognize the rights of the First Peoples of our country, and recognize that no one in Canada today should live with live the reality that so many First Nations in Canada experience, and that we all, as Canadians, First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all Canadians deserve dignity in the Canada of 2011 and the Canada moving forward. Thank you very much.
Questions and comments?